To say that the Second World War had a major impact on Japan's economy would be an understatement. 4 years of trying to control the entire Pacific Ocean had stretched the resources of its military, and by extension the whole country, perilously thin, and U.S. bombers had destroyed most of its heavy industry. Even the smaller factories and workshops which produced consumer goods had been devastated by firebombing campaigns, like the Great Tokyo Air Raid of 1945, which destroyed entire districts of the city with such savage efficiency that the question of whether it was ethical under generally accepted rules of warfare is still being debated by historians. It's entirely possible that if Nintendo had been founded in Tokyo rather than Kyoto, it wouldn't exist today. The Japanese companies of Nintendo's vintage that are still with us generally belong to the same small group of industries which have produced long-lived companies all over the world: steel manufacturing, shipbuilding, banking, insurance, food and beverages, that kind of thing. Playing card manufacturing is not one of these industries. The only other company I can think of that's as old as Nintendo and in the same business is the United States Playing Card Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, which is from a country that hasn't had a war fought on its own soil since the company was founded. Even in the broader field of commercial printing, firms tend to be small, scrappy, and short-lived, unless they get bought up by a big publisher or some other conglomerate. And unlike many Japanese companies, Nintendo has never really been a conglomerate or part of one. By moving into the toy business in the mid-1960s, Nintendo was trading one tough market for another one. Toy manufacturers also tend to be short-lived and face a lot of competition, because the barrier to entry is so low. Almost anybody can start making and selling toys with a small capital investment, which is part of what attracted Nintendo to them in the first place. There are a few really old companies in the toy business, like Hamleys in the UK and FAO Schwarz in the United States. But these are retailers, not manufacturers, so the market looks quite different to them. All they have to do is effectively market the toys that manufacturers come up with. Nintendo was entering the side of the business where it was their job to come up with the clever ideas for new toys. And this was a business that was rapidly changing just at the time that Nintendo wanted to break into it. For years before this, Japanese toys made for both foreign and domestic markets had been pretty simple. Cars, planes, and military vehicles made of sheet metal and painted in bright colors had been a perennial favorite since before the war. One ironically popular post-war toy was a reproduction of the same B-29 bomber that had recently destroyed much of Tokyo. And traditional Japanese toys, like kokeshi dolls, tops, kendama, and darumo otoshi, were even simpler and cheaper to make. All you really needed was wood, string, and a few dollops of paint. But by the mid-1950s, imagination was flooding into the world of Japanese toys, beginning with the so-called tin toys made of painted sheet metal. Two particular companies called Yonezawa and Marusan went all out with these toys and started a gold rush, well, tin rush, I guess, which everybody got caught up in. Instead of just being cars or planes, tin toys could now be almost anything. City buses filled with painted-on people, hovercrafts, submarines, trains, spaceships, robots, and a whole zoo full of animals. Even the cars were given a new dimension with features like wind-up or friction motors that let them race across the floor. Not to mention all the possibilities of battery operation, which was a fad in Japan practically before American kids had heard of it. And there were more massive changes in store. By the mid-60s, automation and assembly lines had mostly replaced the traditional handcrafting that Japan was once known for, and sheet metal had given way to plastic, which was cheaper and lighter and could be easily dyed in different colors, rather than laboriously hand-painted. For Nintendo, which had already automated its card manufacturing, this was the general model to imitate. On the other hand, as far as specific models go, aside from the somewhat behind-the-times Yonezawa and Marusan, Nintendo would definitely have been aware of 3 leading toy companies, all of them headquartered in Tokyo. One which had a history stretching back 40 years, one which was exceptionally good at licensing Western brands, and one which, despite having neither of these advantages, was rapidly climbing to the top and would soon kick practically everybody's butt. The first was named Tomy, the second Takara, and the third, probably the only one you've heard of before, was Bandai. But we'll get to that one in a bit. First, I call these two twins not because they were born at the same time. Tomy is the older of the two by several decades, but because they grew up right next to each other in the same part of Tokyo, and competed in mostly the same product categories. Tomy was founded in 1924 as the Tomiyama Toy Works by Eiichiro Tomiyama, the oldest son of a once wealthy merchant family. His father, Teijiro, had lost a retail empire in 1907 due to a business slump in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War, and the family fell on hard times as a result. Eiichiro started his career at the age of 9 as an apprentice bookbinder, but within a few years he had abandoned this apprenticeship to work at a nearby toy factory. This work kindled a passion for toy making that would stay with him for the rest of his life, and he scrimped and saved until he had enough money to open his own toy company a few months after his 21st birthday. Tomy's earliest toys were quite similar to the ones Eiichiro had helped to assemble at his old job, mostly airplanes made of sheet metal. Later, the company branched out into other military-style vehicles, such as tanks, and its first big hit in both domestic and export markets was a bright and shiny B-29 bomber in 1951. But it was in the late 50s that Tomy would show itself to be truly innovative, beginning with a battery-powered bubble-blowing elephant, which was a sensation at toy fairs in 1957. This elephant, which looked an awful lot like Dumbo, right down to the bright blue Disney eyes, serves as a touchstone for the shift in Japanese toys. The pedestal it sits on is made of the traditional painted sheet metal, but the elephant itself is covered in fuzzy cloth, looking much cuter than earlier toy animals which were entirely metallic. At the end of its trunk is the toy's major selling point, a plastic bubble blower which dips into a container of bubble liquid and then emits a current of air to blow the bubbles out. This was the turning point for Tomy. From 1958 onward, its toys would be much less metallic and military, and a lot more plastic, colorful, and usually electric. Sky Ping Pong, which came out just a couple of years after the Bubble Elephant, is a good example of what Tomy became known for. It's an ingenious game that uses the same principle as a bubble blower to play ping pong without a table. You just press a button to shoot the ball out of a plastic cone into the air, and your opponent has to catch it in their cone before serving it back to you. It's exactly the kind of half-toy, half-game that would later have a huge influence on Nintendo's creations. Tomy would never completely abandon their metal roots. The Tomica line of die-cast cars is still quite popular today. But most of their famous products are plastic. The Plarail train and track system, Pop-Up Pirate, the Armatron robotic crane, and Zoids, just to give a few examples. Some of their most inspired toys are a combination of several different materials and mechanisms, like my beloved Screwball Scramble, which is more complex than many early video games despite being a physical toy. Today, Tomy's product lineup is more diverse than ever, not just because it's drawing from more than half a century of history, but also because it was enriched by a merger in the mid-2000s with one of its biggest competitors, Takara. Unlike with Tomy, there's not a lot of information available about the early years of Takara or its founder, Yasuda Sato, who passed away just a few years ago in 2019. What is known is that its history began in 1955 with a company known as Sato Vinyl Industries, and as that name suggests, it was not your typical toy company. Takara's early focus was dolls, vinyl dolls to be precise, and they prospered in that submarket for more than a decade before branching out into other kinds of toy. Takara's unique talent was not so much mechanical innovation as aesthetic design and marketing. They were also experts in forming alliances with other toy companies, especially American ones. One of Takara's first non-doll products to become a hit was a Japanese version of Milton Bradley's The Game of Life, and they built on that success both by knocking off American products — their Lika-chan doll of the late 60s was basically Japanese Barbie — and by directly licensing them, like G.I. Joe from Hasbro, and literal Japanese Barbie in the 80s, whose name was changed to Jenny when the licensing deal ended. However, Takara's biggest success would turn out to be a product that Hasbro licensed from them, a series of robotic action figures called Diaclone, first introduced in 1975, whose gimmick was that their limbs could be disconnected, twisted around, and snapped back together to form a machine, usually some type of vehicle. Hasbro licensed the Diaclone figures from Takara, and, with the help of a detailed backstory written by Marvel, turned them into a multimedia juggernaut under the name Transformers. This flair for licensing is something Takara shared in common with Nintendo, which already had a hit Western-branded product in stores before it made a single toy. And while Nintendo never really got into toys or action figures, their earliest non-card products did largely revolve around American imports and board games, just like Takara. However, when you talk about influence, there's one company that no discussion of Japanese toys from the second half of the 20th century can afford to ignore. It's arguably more of a big shot now than it was when Nintendo started competing in the same market, but even as a youngster, it was already a force to be reckoned with. Of all the companies that Nintendo is tangled with, Bandai is arguably the most competitive, and certainly the most unpredictable in terms of how it competed. Its management has been perfectly happy to innovate at times when not much is happening in the toy world, and just as excited to hop on the bandwagon of other companies' successes when they can get away with it. Their Tamagotchi was the symbol for a virtual pet in the US for a year and a half, because there simply wasn't any other product like it. Then Nintendo released Pokémon Red and Blue on the Game Boy, with a massive marketing campaign and unprecedented levels of tie-in. A card game, a TV show, comic books, plus countless toys and other promotional plastic trinkets. Suddenly, when people thought about having a virtual pet, what they were imagining was a Pokémon. And Bandai's response was, hey, we can do that. So they took their Digimon toy, originally positioned as a more boy-friendly Tamagotchi, and made it into a multimedia juggernaut on the lines of Pokémon. It had more than 100 little virtual creatures. It had a TV show. It had a card game. The whole thing was shamelessly riding on Pokémon's coattails, from a marketing perspective at least. But it worked, to the extent that Digimon is still a popular and profitable franchise 25 years later. This wasn't a one-off smart move from Bandai. It's more or less how the company has always operated, constantly switching between R&D-driven innovation and marketing-driven imitation, based on its management's reading of the market. You don't often see an entertainment company acting so tactical. Though I suppose if anyone is going to do it, it would be a firm whose name is taken from an ancient Chinese military text. Bandai Fueki is a term that appears in Six Secret Teachings, a work of roughly the same vintage as Sun Tzu's The Art of War. It's used just once, in a passage about the 5 basic tones of the pentatonic musical scale, which are compared to the 5 classical elements and described as having been unchanged for 10,000 generations, or effectively forever. Bandai's founder, 32-year-old Naoharu Yamashina, liked how the phrase sounded, and its connotations of stability and authority. So when he used his savings from a family textile business to start a tiny toy distribution company in Tokyo, that was the name he chose. The 10,000 Generations Store. It has a nice ring to it, even in English. When he started up in 1950, Yamashina didn't have the money to develop his own products, so he imported and sold a variety of cheap toys at wholesale prices, including dolls, tin toys, and rubber pool floats. Swim toys were actually an early focus for Bandai. Its first original product was the Rhythm Ball, a beach ball with a little bell inside that would ring when you threw it. As the company grew in prominence during the 1960s, this lineup would expand to include motorized bath toys, something called a Naughty Flipper, which was a wind-up dolphin, get your mind out of the gutter, and one of their biggest hits of all time, Crazy Foam, first introduced in 1966. I've only ever seen it described as a bubble-blowing canister, but I have a pretty good idea that this was in fact a licensed version of an American product called Crazy Foam, developed the year before by the American Aerosol Corporation. It's basically bubble bath that you spray out of a can, a very cheap and simple thing to manufacture, but oh, the possibilities a 6-year-old can conjure with it. Astro Boy Battles the Bubble People is only the beginning. And talk about synergy. If you wanted to play that game, you would be using 2 Bandai products, because its first real hit, several years before Crazy Foam, was an action figure of Astro Boy. It was released in 1963, the same year that Osamu Tezuka's pioneering anime series first aired in both Japan and the United States. And incidentally, this was before the term action figure even existed. The American toy maker Hasbro would coin it in 1964, so that it could avoid describing its new G.I. Joe character as a doll. Whatever you call him, Astro Boy was a big hit with Japanese kids, and a guidepost for Bandai to follow going forward. For the next several decades, the company's bread and butter would be licensed toys based on popular franchises. But unlike Takara, whose specialty was reaching across the Pacific, Bandai would focus almost exclusively on Japanese media franchises, starting with Astro Boy and Ultraman, moving toward Kamen Rider and giant robot shows like Mazinger Z in the 1970s, and then really hitting the big time in the 80s with Mobile Suit Gundam. Its plastic Gundam model kits, or Gunpla, aren't exactly toys, nor are they exclusively aimed at kids, but they are among the most successful products made by any toy company. In the 45 years since they were introduced, Bandai has sold more than 700 million model kits. That's not quite as big as Lego, which sells hundreds of millions of sets per year, but it beats the pants off of most famously successful toys, not to mention every video game ever made. Bandai has a lot more history between the early 80s and today, but the truth is I've already gotten a little ahead of myself here. The Japanese toy business after 1980 was marked by increasing consolidation and the seemingly unshakable #1 position of Bandai. Tomy and Takara consistently fought for second place until they merged in 2006, which put them both in second place. The market for children's toys in Japan today is a mature one, without much organizational innovation. While toy sales have grown with surprising speed in recent years, much of that growth is driven not by companies selling more toys, but by selling more expensive toys, many of which are purchased by adults as collectibles. This is true all over the world. Just look at what's been happening to Legos. but especially so in Japan, where the aging of the population has practically forced most toy makers to target a 20-something or even middle-aged demographic in order to secure opportunities for growth in the future. When Nintendo burst onto the toy scene in the mid-1960s, it was looking at a very different situation. If Hiroshi Yamauchi were alive today, I think he'd be really shocked at how much traditionally kiddie companies have gravitated to the post-teenage young adult crowd in both designing and marketing their products. Because this is the reverse of what happened in Nintendo in the 1960s. Its original products were aimed exclusively at adults, but the post-war baby boom and its cultural implications caused opportunities for expansion among that demographic to dry up. Adult men, many of whom were fathers, were being encouraged to act more like a family man, take the kids to an amusement park or a bowling alley or something, rather than spend their evenings out smoking and playing cards with the guys. Still, this is Japan we're talking about, so that pressure was tempered by a hefty amount of social conservatism. Lots of guys continued to smoke, drink, and gamble, but not enough to provide Nintendo with the kind of growth a publicly traded corporation needs to stay competitive. And so Nintendo turned to toys. Sort of. Actually, most of its early efforts would be better described as games, like Punch Race in 1964 and Table Soccer the next year. These were both molded plastic simulations of a real sport, racing and soccer respectively, and another thing they both had in common was that Nintendo did not develop them. Punch Race was a licensed version of a Parker Brothers game called Drag Strip, and Table Soccer was a version of Table Football or Subbuteo, which Nintendo licensed from the British board game publisher Waddington's. These imported offerings allowed Nintendo to dip a toe into the toy market without committing a lot of resources to R&D, a strategy that was being pursued successfully at the same time by Takara. Nintendo's first really original creations, also produced in 1965, were racing games with molded plastic tracks, which looked and played a lot like marble runs. The first of these used tiny cars, but the second, known as a rabbit coaster, used weighted pellets that tumbled end over end down the track, making the race longer and less predictable. This was an early example of Nintendo's knack for putting a fun twist on classic experiences. The next year, 1966, saw the release of several Nintendo games whose design is interesting in retrospect. First was a licensed version of Milton Bradley's Skillet, a ball and a maze puzzle whose design clearly stuck in Nintendo's head for quite a while, judging by the appearance of similar puzzles in the WarioWare series, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and, in a way, the Metroid Prime series. Then we have a very ambitious product, Home Bowling, a toy bowling lane that was almost 3 feet long, with metal bowling balls and plastic pins. Bowling had of course been a national craze in the United States for decades at this point, and there was a brief but intense vogue for it in Japan during the 60s, which led to one of mid-century Tokyo's favorite pastimes, overbuilding. By the early 70s, the bowl-nanza would be over, leaving behind a surplus of bowling alleys that nobody wanted to visit anymore. This is going to be relevant later, by the way, so put a pin in it. Luckily, Nintendo's investment in the fad was limited to this one toy, which it quickly moved on from. In the same year that Home Bowling came out, Nintendo decided to steal Bandai's thunder a little by producing toys based on the super popular Japanese TV series Ultraman. Nintendo wasn't the first toy company to use this license. That would be the Tokyo-based Marusan. But it was the most prolific, creating a deck of Ultraman playing cards, as well as several board games, a themed rabbit coaster, and a picture cutter, which is to say an art kit which used a heated metal wire to let you cut pictures out of a block of styrofoam. By the way, if that sounds a little dangerous for a kid's toy, welcome to the late 1960s. You'll flip when you hear about lawn darts and pyrography kits. But Nintendo's biggest hit of 1966, with the word Ultra in its name, arguably its first original product to count as a toy rather than a game, was not based on Ultraman. Also, it wasn't technically developed by Nintendo, but instead by one of its employees working on his own. Gunpei Yokoi was not a product designer or an artist. He was an electrical engineer whom Nintendo had hired the previous year to work on the assembly line, maintaining the machines that printed and assembled decks of playing cards. He also liked to tinker on the side, and since his work involved considerable downtime, he occupied himself by building a gadget that any maintenance crew would love to have, an extendable metal arm that increased his reach by several feet. However, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who spotted the metal arm while visiting the factory floor one day, didn't see it as a tool at all. To him, this was a toy, and a revolutionary one. What kid wouldn't want to reach across the room and grab stuff at will? You could grab an action figure and throw it across the room. You could grab a book off of a tall shelf, or hand your dad a cookie from the other side of the dinner table. You could grab your sister's hair. Yamauchi intuited that the grabby arm didn't need any real goal or point to be enjoyed. Kids would love it simply because it was fun to use. The Ultra Hand would be released during the Christmas season of 1966 and sell more than 1 million units over the next several years. It was Nintendo's first blockbuster, their equivalent of Tomy's Toy-rible and Bandai's Astro Boy figure. But while those successes had been in established toy categories, train sets, and dolls, this was a unique, almost unprecedented toy concept. Already, Nintendo was showing what a wild card it could be. It could successfully localize a Western product to sell in Japan, like Takara. It could capture the essence of a Japanese media property with toys, like Bandai. It could make something cheap and simple but intrinsically appealing, like Tomy. And most importantly, it could make something like the Ultra Hand that defied all previous business models. So the question is, having tried a little of everything, which of these strategies would it stick with for the long run? Well, if you've been a Nintendo fan for a long time, you might just guess that the answer is all of them. Just because it had had one big hit didn't mean that Nintendo was done experimenting with its toy division. It's true that most toy companies rely on at least one consistent bestseller to stay in business, but Nintendo already had a product like that. It's playing cards. As far as toys were concerned, Nintendo could afford to be eclectic, risking temporary failure in the hope of finding a super toy that would sell millions. And it quickly became apparent that in this game, Nintendo had an ace up its sleeve, Gunpei Yokoi. Realizing that Yokoi's creativity was being wasted in his current role, Hiroshi Yamauchi plucked Yokoi from the assembly line and put him to work inventing more toys. He responded in 1967 with the Ultra Machine, a miniature baseball pitching machine like the kind found in batting cages, except that it used a swinging arm to lob the ball rather than shooting it straight forward. Like bowling, baseball had caught on in Japan after its initial emergence in the United States, but unlike bowling, baseball was not an ephemeral fad. It was a bona fide national obsession, first introduced to Japan in 1872, and only growing in popularity with every passing decade. By 1936, the country had a professional baseball league, and by 1950 there were so many pro teams that they had split into 2 competing leagues, just like what had happened in the United States half a century before. Japanese kids in the 60s freaking loved baseball, and the opportunity to knock one out of the park at home with a device that set the balls up perfectly to be smacked was one no self-respecting boy could pass up. Although the toy was far from cheap, selling for 1,480 yen, equivalent to almost $40 today, it racked up purchases just like the Ultra Hand and brought Nintendo its second million-selling victory. It also started a trend at Nintendo for the rest of the 60s and the early 70s of bringing big public amusements into the home in smaller, simplified forms. While the company continued to make more traditional toys, including a set of building blocks in 1968, which I guarantee would not survive a legal challenge from LEGO, its most unique creations from the period all have a strong whiff of the county fair about them. Baseball, mini roller coasters, that old-timey love tester machine from penny arcades, even the cotton candy. But the most intriguing of all was that old Midway classic, the shooting gallery, which Nintendo would transform into a battery-powered toy through the magic of photo detection. What led up to this was a meeting that Gunpei Yokoi had in 1970 with a man named Masayuki Uemura, who worked as a sales agent for the Sharp Corporation of Tokyo. Sharp was a consumer electronics company, best known for its reliable and inexpensive pocket calculators. Well, inexpensive for the time at least. But it also made a wide range of other products, including the first microwave oven to feature a turntable for even cooking on all sides, and, more relevantly to our story, digital photo sensors, which is to say little switches that would activate when a bright light was shown on them. Yokoi was fascinated by this technology, and with Uemura's help, he designed a toy that Nintendo would dub Kosenju, literally a ray gun, that worked by shooting a beam of light at a target containing one or more photosensors. If your aim was true, the sensor would turn on and activate glowing lights, sounds, or some other mechanical gimmick to indicate a successful shot. Nintendo produced 2 different kinds of ray gun, both based on real firearms, a frontier-style revolver and a truly ferocious-looking rifle in both pump-action and lever-action variants. More varied still were the prospective targets, which eventually included a mounted lion head that roared when hit, nature scenes with a rotating assortment of birds or beasts, a plastic whiskey bottle with a spring-loaded top that would pop off, a roulette wheel and a poker game that would spin into action, and a pair of action figure-like statues that collapsed into a pile only to spring back up for another round before you had time to feel sorry for them. If you were a Japanese kid in the early 1970s, you might easily think that this was the coolest and most original toy anyone had ever come up with. And in that, you would be wrong, about the last part at least. This light gun was not the newest toy concept Nintendo was selling back then. Actually, it was one of the oldest. The first shooting game to use photosensors was created way back in 1936 by the American company Seeburg, a world-famous jukebox manufacturer that had branched out into other electronic amusements beginning in the early 30s. In this game, a cutout of a duck with a photosensitive vacuum tube inside it would bounce around a cabinet until shot with Seeburg's light-shooting rifle, the Rayolite. It could even keep score for you, which none of Nintendo's Kosenju toys was capable of. Elaborate movements and sound effects were nothing new either. A later game by Seeburg, 1949's Shoot the Bear, featured both in the form of a chunky mechanical black bear being chased around a circular path by a trusty hunting dog. When shot through its admittedly gigantic sensor spot, the bear would rear up, turn toward the player with glowing red eyes, and emit a roar that, well, it must have been scary at one point, I guess. These days, it sounds more like a baby carrot going through the garbage disposal. It took a while longer for the technology to reach Japan, but it was already firmly established there by the time Nintendo released its Kosenju toys. Periscope, Sega's 1966 arcade hit that I talked about in the last video, was powered by light gun technology. And Sega wasn't resting on its laurels either. A few years later, it was gearing up to produce an even better light gun game, with animated targets that would disappear off screen when hit, and a targeting system that would register a headshot as being worth more than a body shot. The game, which would release in early 1969, before Nintendo had even thought of using photosensors in its toys, was simply titled Duck Hunt. Nintendo's genius, as it had revealed itself thus far, hadn't been in making amusements bigger and better, but in making them smaller and cheaper, adapting them for use in the home, where the purchaser had greater privacy and scope for his or her imagination. Ironically, what made Nintendo such a great toy company was that it didn't fit the mold of a toy company. It was constantly butting up against the cost and size limitations of the home market. Designers like Gunpei Yokoi wanted to make kids happy, sure, but they also wanted to give free rein to their craziest ideas, things that wouldn't really work as toys, but might work as something else. Something like an arcade game, for instance. And so, without necessarily intending to, Nintendo found itself being drawn away from simple toys and into the market for electromechanical games. They had made good money in the toy business, which they would never really leave behind. Nor for that matter did they leave their original business behind. You can still buy Nintendo playing cards today. But the focus of the company, where they were devoting research dollars and executives' limited attention, was shifting. This was a bigger risk than the expansion into toys had been. I mentioned before that toys have a very low barrier to entry, since they're cheap to make and can be sold in almost any quantity at a profit. This is not true of arcade games, which were costly both to develop and to manufacture, in addition to requiring substantial post-sale maintenance. Not only that, but demand was shakier here as well. There'll always be a demand for toys as long as there are children, but who could say how long arcade games would stick around? Maybe they were just a fad, like bowling. The last thing Nintendo needed was to be stuck with a couple hundred metal cabinets rusting away in a warehouse somewhere because kids were more interested in hiking or watching monster movies than shooting at imaginary planes. So yeah, it was a gamble. But this was a company that had been founded by a gambler. Its current president had already bet the company's future on children's toys, and despite a few ups and downs, he'd made good on that. Every experienced gambler knows that when you've got a hot pair of dice, you've got to stick with them. For better or for worse, taking wild, unnecessary risks had become a tradition at Nintendo, and one thing that Japanese people never do is turn their noses up at tradition.